Good morning. I call this meeting of the Standing Senate Committee on Banking, Trade, and Commerce to order. Today is the 10th meeting in our special study on digital currency, including the potential risks, threats, and advantages of these electronic forms of exchange. The committee has received presentations from government departments and agencies, as well as academics in the fields of economic and monetary history and cryptography. The committee heard from the Bitcoin Strategy Group, the Bitcoin Exchange CA Vertex, and BitAccess. In June, the committee also heard from Interact, PayPal, and BitPay. Yesterday, we heard from two other payment companies, Visa and MasterCard. Today, the committee returns to witnesses directly involved with one of the digital currencies, namely Bitcoin. I welcome from the Bitcoin Embassy, Mr. Francis Pouliot, Director of Public Affairs. Located in Montreal, the Bitcoin Embassy is a non-profit organization that seeks to accelerate and facilitate the adoption of Bitcoin. From the Bitcoin Alliance of Canada, I welcome Mr. Stuart Hoegner, General Counsel, and Mr. Michael Perklin, Director. Mr. Hoegner specializes in legal issues related to the regulation of virtual currencies and is co-authoring with Jillian Friedman, another person I will just introduce in a moment, a chapter on this subject in a forthcoming book. Mr. Perklin is a leading security and technical consultant in the cryptocurrency space, including, but not limited to, Bitcoin. And from the Bitcoin Foundation, we have Ms. Jillian Friedman, Legal Officer, and Guillaume Babin-Tremblay, Treasurer. The mission of the Bitcoin Foundation is to help people exchange resources and ideas about Bitcoin more freely. As mentioned earlier, Ms. Friedman is a specialist in the legal issues relating to virtual currencies. Mr. Babin-Tremblay specializes in the technical aspects of virtual currencies. Quite an interesting panel, as I think you can tell by my background information I have given you. Regarding the format for this morning, we will have opening remarks by Mr. Pouliot, followed by Mr. Hoegner and Mr. Perklin, and then we will hear from Ms. Friedman and Mr. Babin-Tremblay. So each are going to speak, and Mr. Pouliot has 10 minutes, I believe, and the other two groups have 10 minutes, but they are going to split their time 5 minutes each, since each one is making a presentation. So with that, Mr. Pouliot, the floor is yours, sir.
Mr. Chair, Honorable Senators, it is a great privilege and pleasure for me to be here today, and I would first like to thank you for conducting this study and inviting the Bitcoin Embassy. My name is Francis Pouliot, and I am Public Affairs Director at the Bitcoin Embassy in
Slow down just a bit, because what you are saying is being translated, and they may not keep quite
sure.
up to speed with you.
That's why we all talk so slow.
Right. So I'll start again.
Because we're not fast.
One of the reasons. So yes, I am a Public Affairs Director at the Bitcoin Embassy in Montreal, which I am representing here today. But I am also Chief Executive Officer of the Bitcoin Foundation Canada. My background is in public policy analysis and economics. The Bitcoin Embassy is a not-for-profit organization located on Montreal's Saint Laurent Boulevard. Inaugurated in August 2013, it is the first physical space in the world dedicated to educating the public and encouraging the development of cryptocurrency technology. Our model has been replicated by many organizations all across the world. My goal today is to speak on behalf of one of the most important stakeholders in this process, the decentralized community of users, developers, and activists who participate in the Bitcoin ecosystem. My interventions today will focus on Bitcoin's nature as a digital money ecosystem and its social and economic benefits. There is a global social movement at the center of which lies Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. From programmers and mathematicians to lawyers and influential business people, the Bitcoin community is animated by a sincere belief that cryptocurrencies will bring about profound and positive change. Many consider the invention of cryptocurrencies to be one of the most significant technological achievements since the internet. This begs the question, what exactly is cryptocurrency? For the sake of simplicity, I will focus on the most important one of all, Bitcoin. Bitcoin is first and foremost a collection of technologies which are the result of decades of research in mathematics, cryptography, and distributed systems. According to renowned cryptocurrency expert Andreas Antonopoulos, Bitcoin can be conceived as the ingenious combination of the following new technologies: a decentralized peer-to-peer network called the Bitcoin protocol, a decentralized mathematical and deterministic currency issuance system called distributed mining, a decentralized transaction verification system called the transaction script, and a public transaction ledger called the blockchain. Perhaps more important than understanding how these technologies work is appreciating what they allow us to achieve: the creation of an integrated and completely independent digital, monetary, and financial ecosystem that is fully functional and continuously growing. It is the largest and most significant economic experiment in living memory, and its success will have profound socio-economic consequences. Bitcoin's most distinctive feature is that both its network and its currency are completely decentralized, meaning that they are not controlled by any individual or corporation, be it financial institutions or government agencies. Another feature is that the currency and payment network elements of Bitcoin are linked together by what we would call a symbiotic relationship. One simply cannot exist without the other. Bitcoin is at the same time the transaction network and the unit of value transmitted in that network. In any monetary or financial system, certain tasks need to be performed in order for the system to function, such as issuing a currency, preventing counterfeiting, validating transactions between users, keeping track of balance sheets, and physically or digitally storing money. These tasks are today performed by an oligopoly of financial institutions, credit card companies, and central banks. The ability of an individual to accumulate and transfer wealth is highly dependent upon these institutions. Traditional financial institutions and central banks require consumers to trust them if they want to have access to financial services and use national currencies. In just the last few years, we have witnessed all over the world countless credit card frauds, bank bailouts, money supply inflation, financial censorship, arbitrary asset seizures, and privacy violations. In other words, trust is continuously being breached. With Bitcoin, the tasks mentioned above are performed collectively by participants in the network in a decentralized manner. In essence, Bitcoin is a distributed consensus network that maintains a secure and trusted public ledger. The efficiency and coordination of those tasks is achieved because Bitcoin's underlying technologies were designed to produce incentive structures which participants will spontaneously follow. Trust in the system is based on computation and encryption rather than restricted access. This removes the risk of misuse, abuse, and system weakness that can come from centralizing control of a system in the hands of a few. Bitcoin also has interesting philosophical implications. In liberal thought, it is understood that individuals possess rights that are inherent to their very existence, as opposed to being granted by governments. Bitcoin is the first practical implementation of this concept when it comes to property rights. Digital assets are stored as entries in a decentralized ledger, and only the legitimate owner has access to the assets without relying on any third party, such as a bank. Inside the Bitcoin network, this right is inalienable and self-enforced through encryption techniques. Freedom of transaction is also absolute and irrevocable, since within the network it is extremely difficult or practically impossible to stop a transaction from taking place. The implications are not only philosophical. The liberating power of Bitcoin comes with considerable economic benefits. The Bitcoin network allows willing parties to transact instantly and directly with each other without the need for a trusted third party from and to anywhere in the world with minimal costs. No documentation or permit is necessary. It basically gives everyone on Earth, regardless of their status or wealth, the possibility to instantly teleport cash from one impenetrable vault to another. By removing the need to trust a middleman in order to conclude a transaction, Bitcoin removes all the economic inefficiencies or frictions related to intermediation. It makes commercial and financial activity cheaper, more convenient, and safer. It allows resources previously lost in transactions to be efficiently reinvested elsewhere. For the average user, Bitcoin will perform the exact same function as a credit card, albeit faster, with no risk of fraud or identity theft, and without the high fees. It is important for policymakers to remember the technological origin of cryptocurrencies. It is not simply another payment system to be studied within the conceptual framework of traditional financial services, nor is it simply a new form of money whose macroeconomic properties can be studied out of context, as if it was just another foreign currency, commodity, or precious metal. Bitcoin's growing adoption must be viewed within the scope of creative destruction, the process by which new and better technologies replace their obsolete predecessor. Everybody gains from such a process, except the business models that are gradually rendered obsolete, which most likely will be the most vocal in their effort to slow the rise of digital currencies. In this respect, I speak uniquely of Bitcoin, whose primary function is to transfer value. Other cryptocurrency systems which allow self-enforcing smart contracts, decentralized autonomous corporations, decentralized marketplaces for goods, services, and financial products are currently being developed. If these technologies become functional and widely accepted, there is really no limit to the efficiency gains that we can achieve. Of course, with more freedom comes more responsibility, which is synonymous to increased risk. Bitcoin has suffered from cyber attacks, reputation damage, bankruptcies, government restrictions, and incredible price swings. It was pronounced dead several times, yet it is still here and is stronger than ever. This is because risks in Bitcoin are assumed primarily by individual actors and are not transferred to the system as a whole. The failure of one actor does not negatively affect the viability of the system. In fact, the Bitcoin system loves these kind of failures because it provides the opportunity to evolve and come out stronger. For example, the failure of Mt. Gox, at the time the world's largest Bitcoin exchange, has led to incredible security innovations and safer business models. Because of this evolutionary quality, it is perhaps unwarranted to artificially decrease these risks via regulation when innovation continues to make Bitcoin safer. To conclude, I would like to talk specifically about Bitcoin and Canada. Canada is gaining a significant competitive edge compared to other jurisdictions in terms of capital investment potential and job creation in the Bitcoin industry. Our country is now perceived as a Bitcoin-friendly world leader in the cryptocurrency space. This reputation will prove to be extremely valuable as global adoption of these new technologies arise. While data is scarce and hard to obtain, we know that we have the largest amount of Bitcoin ATMs in the world. Earlier in 2014, Canada ranked second in terms of Bitcoin capital investments. Canadians are a tech-savvy nation with a high rate of internet penetration and a highly skilled labor force. Canada also has the potential for competitive electricity rates, which could make it a destination for cryptocurrency mining operations. There are organized Bitcoin meeting groups in almost every major Canadian city, with at least 5 influential Bitcoin organizations. Canada has a very real potential to become a global hub for the cryptocurrency industry, which will attract investments and quality jobs. Tomorrow's consumer economy will heavily depend on economic interactions conducted over the internet. We can envision a future where individuals in different countries will exchange goods and services, conduct business, negotiate self-enforcing contracts, instantly and directly using cryptocurrency systems. For the foreseeable future, however, these interactions will be conducted using software and online platforms that are nevertheless developed and operated by people. There will be a global demand for these services, and as a nation, we can only gain if these services are being developed in Canada rather than elsewhere. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering your questions regarding the concept of cryptocurrencies, their associated risk and benefit, and the Bitcoin economy.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hoegner.
Mr. Chair, honorable senators, it's a pleasure to be with you this morning to speak to you about digital currency. I'd like to thank you for your invitation to appear and to thank your clerk, Ms. Reynolds, and her staff for helping me prepare. Mr. Perklin and I each have short statements to make, following which we hope to answer any questions that you may have. Mr. Chair, you alluded to this earlier. I'm also providing an advanced draft paper that Ms. Friedman and I wrote on the law of Bitcoin in Canada to be published in the coming months in an effort to inform the committee's deliberations. We've provided that to Ms. Reynolds. As a starting observation, let me say that this committee's work is being watched with great interest by the cryptocurrency community. I am aware of no other parliamentary body in the world that has publicly canvassed the breadth of materials and opinion that this committee has. Many of the questions and discussions kindled by these hearings have been excellent. We are here on behalf of the Bitcoin Alliance of Canada. The Alliance is a Canadian federal not-for-profit corporation dedicated to raising awareness about Bitcoin among Canadian consumers, merchants, and policymakers, to promoting Bitcoin adoption in Canada, and to furthering the study and research of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. The law can have a difficult time addressing and categorizing technology like Bitcoin. Perhaps this isn't surprising because Bitcoin has so many features that make it truly innovative and special. In some areas of law, existing structures seem ready and able to accommodate and address Bitcoin. In others, Bitcoin doesn't seem to fit so well into the current rules. And I want to speak to you very briefly today about some of these issues. Let's consider the 2014 budget changes in Bill C-31, which received royal assent this past June. The government has elected to specifically address virtual currencies through amendments to the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Financing Act and regulations. This was done by expressly adding dealing in virtual currencies as defined by regulation to the definition of money services business. Representatives of the Department of Finance referred to this change when they met with you in the spring. They have given some indication about what dealing in virtual currencies means. While this appears to be a reasonable accommodation of the usefulness of Bitcoin, we are reserving judgment on these changes until we see what the new regulations say. One of the key questions that Bitcoin raises is, what is money? And by this I mean not just money as we're used to thinking about it in an everyday context, but what does the law mean when it refers to money? It sounds like a strange question, but really it's a fundamental one, given how much the law revolves around this thing that we call money. My answer to you is that, as we conclude in the paper, legal money in Canada for many purposes likely does not include Bitcoin. Certainly, the CRA and the Bank of Canada do not see Bitcoin as money. It's not legal money because it's not issued by any state and because it's not universally accepted. Now, one might be inclined to think, so what? But this answer has some interesting implications. Because if Bitcoin is not legal money, then it can't, for example, denominate a negotiable instrument under the Bills of Exchange Act. And if that's true, then Bitcoin-denominated instruments and Bitcoins themselves may be subject to prior claims in commercial transactions. So in some cases, it's not clear how current law in Canada can address Bitcoin. This does not mean that Bitcoin isn't brilliant or profoundly innovative. It's both of those things. And it doesn't mean that Bitcoin won't find its own way of addressing these issues. What it does mean is that the law is narrow and may not accommodate certain innovation all that well. The final point I want to address is in the area of anti-money laundering compliance. There's a myth that Bitcoin businesses cannot be brought under the umbrella of a proper AML and counter-terrorist financing regime. While there are challenges that we face in building sound AML CTF compliance programs for Bitcoin participants, these challenges can be met, and I submit are being met. For example, linking identity with funds and determining sources of funds can be done in this environment where called for. We believe that the challenge for law enforcement is new, but not necessarily greater. I will leave it to Michael to speak about investigatory techniques in greater detail. Thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Perklin.
Thank you, Stuart, and thank you, Honourable Senators and Ms. Reynolds, for inviting me here to speak with you today. As Mr. Hoegner mentioned, my comments will be made from the point of view of an investigator. Over the last 10 years, I've been employed as a digital forensic investigator. I've conducted investigations into fraud, money laundering, and identity theft that were all conducted using technology, both traditional, such as cell phones and computers, and advanced, such as with computer viruses and malware designed to steal bitcoins. My comments today will address how cryptocurrency technology impacts the investigative process that is applied by banks and corporations to investigate fraud, money laundering, and identity theft. The simple facts are that cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin can be used to launder money and as instrumentalities of crime. It's important to note, however, that the same can be said for Canadian dollars, prepaid value cards like gift cards, and every other valuable good, whether it is physical or digital in nature. It is up to whoever wields the tool to use it appropriately and follow applicable laws and regulations. At the same time, there are crucial differences in how cryptocurrency technology operates that provide advantages for investigators to help ensure compliance with applicable laws. I'd like to highlight one of the biggest differences for you today. While investigating money laundering cases in the past, it was common to see money withdrawn to different bank accounts across the country or internationally. In order to investigate, our team would request banking records associated with a particular account from a respondent bank, for example, the Royal Bank of Canada. Naturally, these requests take time, so it was typical to see delays of 2 to 4 weeks, after which we'd receive the transaction list for that one account at that one bank. After reviewing that information, we would identify transactions that involved sending or receiving funds to or from bank accounts at other banks, for example, CIBC. Investigators would then need to request the records from CIBC only to find that those records point to yet another account, say at the Bank of Montreal. It's worth noting that this example refers only to Canadian banks. If amounts were remitted to or received from banks in other countries, that would give rise to further issues and delays as well. Every day across Canada, companies are devoting personnel to investigating financial crimes, money laundering, and identity theft. This requires a significant amount of work by each investigator on each team in collaboration with each other and the banks. Bitcoin, by contrast, is significantly different. Bitcoin requires every token or every set of coins to be validated to ensure that it has not been counterfeited. The protocol does this by logging every transaction and tracking every coin as it moves from address to address within the network. All of this information is stored in a single common ledger called a blockchain. If a coin can be traced back through every transaction in this ledger, all the way back until the Coinbase transaction, or the originating transaction which created that coin, it is proven to be genuine. These ledgers, these blockchains, are readable by all. Every account number is listed as an address, and each of those account balances can be easily calculated by adding the transactions together. As a result, an investigation into the flow of money arising from any allegedly fraudulent transaction can be as simple and straightforward as reading a spreadsheet. There are no 2 to 4 week delays, and there are no need to reassemble transactions from multiple ledgers at separate institutions. This mechanism exposes the movement of funds to everyone and makes cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin some of the most easily traceable forms of value that exist. Canadian entrepreneurs and professionals are leading some key projects in the cryptocurrency space. To the extent that policymakers wish to adopt new rules, we will continue to advocate an approach that does not stifle this innovation, that does not discriminate against cryptocurrency, and that takes careful notice of cryptocurrency's benefits to Canadian consumers and merchants alike. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Perklin. Ms. Friedman, please.
Mr. Chair and Honourable Senators, Mr. Babin-Tremblay and I are both here as directors of the Bitcoin Foundation Canada, the BFC. On behalf of our organization, we thank you for the invitation to appear before you. The BFC is a federal not-for-profit corporation that is affiliated with the Bitcoin Foundation, a global organization headquartered in the United States. Currently, there are 9 affiliated Bitcoin foundations in as many countries. The BFC is mandated to coordinate and lead efforts to protect and promote Bitcoin in Canada. This includes monitoring regulatory and legislative developments, educational campaigns, and supporting maintenance and improvement to the Bitcoin protocol. I also speak to you as a member of the Quebec Bar, and my remarks today will focus on consumer protection law in Quebec and digital currency, specifically Bitcoin. We can identify the applicable legal rules by looking at the function or activity in which Bitcoin is being used. To quote American Judge Frank H. Easterbrook, the best way to learn the law applicable to specialized endeavors is to study general rules. Guided by that principle, it is clear that claims that Bitcoin offers consumers no consumer protection at all are simply false. The question is not so much whether consumers need to be protected, but whether they need more protection than they already have. Consumer protection laws are broad and apply to consumer contracts for goods or services where Bitcoin is tendered as payment, whether the transaction is defined as barter or otherwise. Additionally, the chapter on sale in the Civil Code of Quebec applies, mutatis mutandis, to contracts up for exchange. A consumer's purchase of Bitcoin from an exchange or vendor would also, in principle, be governed by these rules. What does this mean? Consumers tendering payment in Bitcoin or purchasing Bitcoin enjoy implied and legal warranties under consumer protection law and the Civil Code. Additionally, Bitcoin exchange services subject to Quebec consumer law have to disclose any fees they charge to consumers, including exchange fees. It merits mention that traditional financial service providers are also subject to this rule and must disclose fees related to currency conversion services, as was confirmed earlier this month by the Supreme Court. Merchants must also provide instructions necessary for the protection of the consumer against risk or danger of which the consumer would otherwise be unaware. This obligation is relevant when dealing with a technology as novel and complex as Bitcoin, especially since many users are still unaware of basic security precautions that need to be taken. A key complaint about Bitcoin is that the irreversibility of transactions is seen to favor the merchant over the consumer. This is considered anathema to consumer protection law, which is designed to do the opposite. Recall, however, that consumer protection law is not beholden to chargeback technology for the protection of consumers engaging in online commerce. In Quebec, the online merchant must perform his obligation before exacting payment unless a credit card is used. This means that if an online merchant sells goods and services for Bitcoin in Quebec to Quebec consumers, he must deliver before the consumer is required to pay. The Bitcoin sector has shown great interest in building its own solutions to the problem of trust in consumer transactions. One is the use of multi-signature addresses that require multiple permissions or signatures to transmit funds from a Bitcoin wallet. An escrow agent or dispute arbitrator can hold one key to a multi-signature wallet and the consumer and seller the other two. Securities law, which is premised on protection of the investing public, is the other major area of consumer protection law where Bitcoin and related technology is concerned. As is further set out in the paper submitted by Attorney Hoegner and I, Bitcoin is likely not a security. Nevertheless, Bitcoin or other digital assets can be used as the unit of account underlying some part of a securities transaction, whether it be consideration for issuance or an investment fund denominated in Bitcoin. It is important to examine digital currency in the context of a broader innovation known as Decentralized Autonomous Organization Technology, or DAOs. Decentralized autonomous organizations are software built to run on their own and mimic the operations of a corporation. The use of DAOs to raise funds, spend them, and make distributions through participation of its stakeholders is a highly anticipated use of this technology and has already been subject to experimentation. An issuance of ownership units and their trade in a secondary market may engage provincial security rules. We must acknowledge that digital currency technology is distinct from the programs and services that operate on it. Where possible, legal obligations should be based on the function performed rather than the technology or medium used to execute it. In the spirit of competition and technological neutrality, legal treatment of digital currency should avoid favoring the use of one technology over the other. Bitcoin is complicated and impressive, and it requires a substantial level of technological understanding. It is encouraging that the Canadian government is indeed educating itself before making any decisions on these matters. The opportunity to share my thoughts and research with you here today has been a great honor, and I thank you.
Thank you very much. Monsieur Babin-Tremblay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, honorable senators. It's a pleasure to present before this committee and to share some of my experiences related to digital currencies. I currently serve as the Executive Director of the Bitcoin Embassy in Montreal, and I'm also co-founding Director and the Treasurer of the Bitcoin Foundation Canada. My background is in quantitative finance and financial software development, and I spent the last 12 years providing consulting services to a number of financial institutions worldwide. Relying on my professional expertise in quantitative analysis, I will present a number of significant indicators that are used in the measurement of various aspects of the Bitcoin network. I will end my opening statement with some conclusions supported by empirical observations of these indicators, as well as by some elements of fundamental analysis and personal experience in the industry dating back to 2011. I invite you to use a question period to seek clarifications regarding my conclusions and methodology, and or to ask questions pertaining to the indicators themselves. I also encourage inquiries about current trends and future projections of interest to the committee. The first category of indicators are the network indicators. They yield information about the usage of the Bitcoin network and help measure its internal characteristics. Such indicators include self-explanatory ones, like the number of transactions per day or the number of addresses currently in use, but also less obvious indicators, such as the number of Bitcoin days destroyed, which represents a measure of the average age of the Bitcoins being moved during a particular period. In addition to network indicators are what I would call external indicators, which describe the relationship between the Bitcoin network and the physical world, as they are constrained by outside limiting factors. Examples would include the current network's hashing rate, or the approximate energy consumption or amount of work collectively completed by the network so far. These indicators serve as measurement of how much resources are miners willing to expend to mine new Bitcoins and to offer an alternative to only using the exchange rate in determining the acquisition cost of a Bitcoin. I also include in this category industry indicators such as the number of wallets serviced by leading companies, number of Bitcoin ATMs per country, so on and so forth. Finally, financial indicators relate to the interfacing between the fiat and crypto value systems and serve to monitor the ongoing price discovery process of Bitcoin. They can also be seen as synthesis indicators that explain the relationship between the network and external indicators, mapping various stochastic processes to costs and benefits incurred by using or servicing the network. Base indicators will obviously include exchange rates, volume, trading volume, and market capitalization, while technical indicators can also be applied to cryptocurrencies, such as, for example, the Chaikin oscillator to measure volatility of exchange rates, or the monetary flow index, which will help us estimate wealth flowing in and out of the digital currency system at various price levels. Using fundamental observations and the aforementioned indicators, I have arrived at the following conclusions. 1. According to nearly all external and network indicators, the growth of the Bitcoin network has been following constant linear increase over the last 3 years. Based on stronger than ever fundamentals, this trend is likely to continue. 2. Over the same period, market capitalization and exchange rates have been behaving consistently with typical exponential growth patterns associated to a growing network effect. This conclusion is consistent with Metcalfe's law. A network's value is equivalent to its number of nodes squared, as can be demonstrated by comparing indicators used to support conclusion 1 and 2. Number 3, long-term volatility in exchange rates is decreasing rapidly. Additional stabilization can be expected by the introduction of more derivatives and swap facilities and more seamless fiat to crypto conversion processes, as well as by a general increase in long-term liquidity trends. 4, China continued to act as a main driver of Bitcoin exchange rates, with Chinese exchanges providing roughly 70% of the trading volume and more often than not leading global price movements. 5. Short-term consolidation of the cloud mining industry is expected to continue due to an increasing energy, hosting, and cooling costs in relation to expected mining revenues, which will tend to narrow the gap between the production and purchasing costs of a Bitcoin. 6. Advantageous positioning of Canada in cryptocurrency mining on a global competitive scale cannot be ensured by our relative low energy and cooling costs alone. However, a leadership position is attainable and sustainable provided Canada maintains a light, technology-neutral, fiscal and regulatory framework. This will likely secure for Canada an important early mover advantage and result in considerable investments from venture capital firms and in an overall positive economic outcome. 7. While the replacement of sovereign currencies by Bitcoin seems an unlikely scenario, I believe it is probable that the emergence of cryptocurrencies as a common payment method will put pressure on states and other leaders in the private sector to issue their own competing cryptocurrencies, complementing or supplanting legacy currencies. A scenario where a number of state-issued and privately issued currencies would compete globally while being exchangeable with very low friction would most likely result in an optimal currency efficiency and in the first truly globally inclusive payment network in the history of humanity. I hope these remarks proved insightful, and I welcome any comments or questions. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much to each of you. I can tell by the number of questions that I have on my list here from senators, you've sparked a lot of interest. But let me start off by asking you a question, Mr. Pouliot, and I have to admit I am very confused. Now, I have to also admit this is not the first time, nor will it be the last. But if I go back to my opening remarks, I indicated that in the spring of this year, the committee heard from the Bitcoin Strategy Group, the Bitcoin Exchange CA Vertex, and BitAccess. And my recollection is that they were all basically requesting regulation. Let us get on with it. Regulate us. Now I look at your remarks and I see it says, it is perhaps unwarranted to artificially decrease these risks via regulation when innovation continues to make Bitcoin safer. Could you help clarify the positions? Are
Sure.
you looking for regulations or you're not looking for regulation?
Well, I'm speaking on behalf of a nonprofit organization, which, although people involved and many of its supporters are businesses and actors in the cryptocurrency space, I'm speaking for the welfare of the entire system. So it's certainly possible that certain businesses might have wanted regulations to come quickly so that they can get over with and adjust accordingly, or it's possible that certain businesses might also want regulations for other reasons. But as a nonprofit organization who really thinks for the benefit of the system as a whole, I stand by the comments in my statement.
Well, I might just ask the other groups. Are you looking for regulation or are you against regulation? Obviously, you have to know specifically what they are, but in principle.
I believe that the participants in the Bitcoin ecosystem right now are regulated. And as you mentioned, Mr. Chair, the Department of Finance has indicated that new regulations are coming online, folding dealing in virtual currencies, we don't know what that means yet, into the PCM LTFA. Again, we don't know what those regulations say yet. With that said, new regulation needs to be, I would submit, carefully considered, not discriminate against digital currencies, and truly acknowledge the innovative potential that this space offers and the growth that it offers in this country. So we think that they are we think that instrumentalities of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies are currently regulated. They are going to be further regulated per the Department of Finance. New regulations, if brought online, and you will discuss that, I presume, in phase 2 of your deliberations, are provided they respect this space and provided that they are technologically neutral, would be welcome.
Mr. Babin-Tremblay, would you have a position that you want to express?
Well, I think regulation in itself is a big word. What does it really mean is depends on who you are and what's your role in the industry. One of the most important thing that I see is more about clarification rather than regulation per se. As a Bitcoin entrepreneur, one of the issues that I faced several times was relating to opening a bank account, for example. Most of the banks in Canada are very wary of working with Bitcoin entrepreneurs. They have like I guess a risk compliance regime, a compliance regime that does not include Bitcoin. They don't really know how to treat it, and I think like clarification goes a long way here to help them like figure it out and see how it fits their current business model. So I believe that it's not as much as it's not regulation per se that's required. It's really more clarification about where Bitcoin falls. And I think my colleagues here have made very insightful statements as of what the situation is today.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to my list, starting with the Deputy Chair of the Committee, Senator Payette, to be followed by Senator Tkachuk.
Alors, bienvenue et
Welcome. My questions are essentially for the representatives of the Foundation. And I have to say I'm very surprised concerning Canadian tax law. I'm surprised that a foundation can be created that has to do with the currency. As far as I know, there's no foundation that is based on euros or existing currencies. So what is the objective? Is this a charitable organization? Is this an organization that represents the interests of Canadian consumers? I haven't really properly understood what the mission of your foundation really is and why the government would consider you a nonprofit organization with tax benefits. I really don't understand that. So I want to know how you define yourselves.
I'm happy to answer that. The Bitcoin Foundation Canada is incorporated via the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, which provides that legal entities can be incorporated under this statute that serve various purposes. Of course, the many not-for-profits incorporated under this act are also registered charities and also serve more traditional public interest, like providing sports for children, for example. Not-for-profit corporations can also be incorporated under this statute that have objectives that are simply not-for-profit. The objectives of this not-for-profit corporation are to educate the public, to monitor regulatory and legislative developments, and to support maintenance and improvement of the Bitcoin protocol. So that means that we are not actively running a business and trying to make money. That's the principal distinction. The Bitcoin Foundation Canada, though, while it is a not-for-profit corporation, is not a registered charity. And registered charities are the entities that receive the greater tax benefits under the Income Tax Act, I believe.
mais il reste quand même que
But the fact remains that the entire budget and all of the money that you have in your foundation will not be taxed. You will not pay any tax to the federal or provincial governments. If it's non-profit, that means that that the governments will not benefit whatsoever from your operations.
Well, in principle, that's correct. I'm not a tax expert, so I can't speak to the exact tax obligations of a not-for-profit corporation.
d'où viennent vos revenus?
Where does your revenue come from?
Membership fees.
Okay.
I'm sorry, could I just interrupt? I have a supplementary on your question.
Just to try and get to the bottom of this. You don't have a charitable
We are not
tax number.
No.
You would be formed under the same statutes that the Canadian Bankers Association
Correct.
would be, the
Right.
Insurance Bureau of Canada, the Meat Council, etc., right?
Exactly.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Continue.
Just a second. Ah oui. Toute la
Now, in one of your testimonies, we heard that China continues to be the engine or the driver of Bitcoin exchange. It seems to me that for years, China has been blamed for not appropriately evaluating the value of its currency. So can you explain to me how Bitcoin will now become an economic engine used, it's used 70% by the Chinese, when we look at the systems that countries use to evaluate their currencies, they haven't even managed to correctly approximate the value of their currency on the world stage. So can you explain to me how they can be an economic driver when, in my opinion, they don't respect the fair value of their currency. I'd be happy to answer that question. Essentially, we know that China has one of the most controlling economies in the world. It's very difficult for someone who is not Chinese to take yen out of China. There's also very significant currency control happening there. And I think that Bitcoin is, in a sense, a solution to that problem. Bitcoin is not sanctioned by governments, and for about a year, China has been giving out sort of contradictory information as to whether they will allow the use of Bitcoin or whether they want to control it. Ultimately, I think it will be up to the people to decide. People there need significant economic alternatives if they want to trade with other countries. And so that's why Bitcoin is so popular over there. It is seen as a way of carrying out transactions with other countries, but according to rules that are not necessarily imposed by a central government like the Chinese government. But there's also a major financial center there, Hong Kong, and I would imagine that Hong Kong is the driver of this. And obviously, they don't like the continental policies, so perhaps they're using this as a way of getting around the Chinese government's rules. That's probably part of it. In the document that I gave you, which is in the appendix, there's sort of a breakdown of the volume of Bitcoin transactions, and there's really a lot of yen. You can see that the yen is marked there. That is the currency that is used most commonly for Bitcoin exchanges in China. But there are also major transactions happening through Hong Kong, and I imagine they're trying to let some capital in and out more freely. So I think that's also part of the question. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Tkachuk, to be followed by Senator Massicotte.
Thank you very much for your presentations. And my questions, you can decide who answers them. So I've just got a series of them. Who uses Bitcoins? Well, I know, but is it business people? Is it professional people?
Yes.
Is it?
Anyone wants to answer?
Who uses it?
Bitcoin is a technology that allows immediate payment from anywhere to anywhere with very low friction. That technology is useful for anybody who needs to remit payment anywhere in the world, whether it's to someone standing next to them or someone on the other side of the globe. So I guess my answer is anyone from companies to citizens of any country use Bitcoin.
Can Bitcoin operate without any regulation? I mean, does it need regulation to operate? I mean, we hear this, that, should it be regulated or should it not? But does it need regulation? Can we just let it go? I mean, why do we have to regulate it? If people are using it, more people will use it. Why do we have to regulate?
Bitcoin, to directly answer your question, Bitcoin could certainly survive without any regulation at all. And in many markets, it's very lightly regulated or completely unregulated. To comport with things like anti-money laundering, counter-terrorist financing rules, and principles set up by the FATF, among others, it's prudent for us to have some kind of regulation, likely at the choke points, involving Bitcoin. So where Bitcoin goes from fiat to Bitcoin or vice versa, that is an appropriate spot, at least to establish some kind of oversight.
So will it be like a value that would be designated to the Bitcoin? In other words, for the purpose of money laundering, we have laws on the amount of cash that can be moved in one transaction, say $10,000 worth. If you send over $10,000, someone has to report it. So will you have a Bitcoin amount that can be sent? All of a sudden, sending the money will become much more difficult, will it not? Or sending the Bitcoin will become much more difficult. You won't be able to transact. You'll be like the banks.
No,
You'll be like individuals using ordinary currency, would you not?
To answer your original question, yes. As we outline in the paper, we believe that we can expect to see regulations from the Department of Finance that mirror the current thresholds that are established by regulation in the Proceeds of Crime, Money Laundering, and Terrorist Financing Act. So at that point, we expect, we don't know yet because we haven't seen the regulations, we expect to see various thresholds in Canadian dollars that Bitcoin will be matched against and need to be valued against in order to determine various reporting and record-keeping requirements.
Okay.
When it comes to transacting with large amounts, already banks have to report $10,000 or more to authorities. When someone decides to transact that large amount or more in cash, there is no reporting. It's voluntary, where the people participating in such a transaction have to let the authorities know. There's no easy way to tell if that is occurring under our noses or not. With Bitcoin, because everything uses the central blockchain as its ledger, we can easily tell when large volumes of Bitcoin are being transacted. At least in comparison to cash, which already has these problems, Bitcoin doesn't have similar problems as cash.
Good, yes.
I could just add.
I got hustled along here.
The question of should Bitcoin be regulated, to a very large extent, Bitcoin already is regulated. Bitcoin is subject to the principles of law, does not exist in a legal vacuum. There's a rule of law in this country, and the people are subject to rule of law, and our transactions are as well. And to that extent, at the very least, Bitcoin is subject to the law and is regulated. And we've seen from the Department of Finance and in the amendments to the federal anti-money laundering law that, as Mr. Hoegner mentioned, the choke points of risk have been identified with respect to where Bitcoin perhaps needs more specific, targeted legal oversight, and so that's been done and is currently being with the amendments in Bill C-31.
Bitcoin isn't the only cryptocurrency. There are others. How many others are there, and can they be? Can they be exchanged? In other words, can one cryptocurrency be exchanged for another? And how is that value arrived at?
There's probably around, I would assert a number between 500 and 1,000 alternative cryptocurrencies. There's new ones being created daily, pretty much. And there's also a number, probably, I would say, it's very hard to come up with the exact figures, but I would say between 50 and 100 altcoin exchanges that are specialized in exchanging Bitcoins with other currencies. So you, as a user, would create an account, you'd deposit some Bitcoins there, and then you could buy some Litecoins or Dogecoins if you wanted for your Bitcoins. So yes, there are exchanges, quite a few of them, and they all have their own rates, it's market-based.
Do you all take a little piece of the action as
Yes.
they go through, just like a regular currency exchange?
It's usually much less. It's usually around 0.2% or something. So it's actually very low in the pure digital world. There's a lot of competition, so that drives the costs down.
And I have a couple more, but I know there are others. So if there is a second
Down
round,
for second
I'll take
round. We have Senator Massicotte, to be followed by Senator Bellemare.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci à vous tous d'être parmi nous.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you all for being here with us. This has been very interesting, and I think it's a very important subject. Mr. Perklin, my question is for you. We've heard a lot of testimony, and there's a debate between whether Bitcoin transactions are really confidential or not, and whether it might lead to money laundering. Now, I think you recognized that, yes, Bitcoin does entail that risk, and that it's a fact. But is that true or not? The testimony is not always the same. We've heard different testimony.
When it comes to could you clarify the question, please? Sorry.
In other words, there's some debate. We're getting different testimony. Is Bitcoin transactions confidential, and therefore leads to obviously encouragement of of whitewashing or basically money laundering. Is that a facet, or can we find out, and if there's a situation, can FinTrack or the police find out who transacted a certain transaction?
Excellent question. When it comes to using Bitcoin, because every transaction flows through the blockchain, anybody can see any amount of funds moving from a numbered account to another numbered account. We've seen in the United States already there have been arrests dealing with money laundering associated with the Silk Road website, which is a website used to sell illicit goods on the internet, and people who were involved with this were allegedly identified and charged. It still remains whether they are guilty.
Yeah, I understand the blockchain. I understand, obviously, that's where the computer program works. But can you find out the identity behind each blockchain?
It is possible to identify who owns a specific account using a variety of investigative techniques. Some examples include the IP address that was used to broadcast a transaction, if it's associated with a home or a business or some other.
So therefore, it's erroneous when people say it's confidential.
Bitcoin is definitely not confidential.
I appreciate it, but the identity is not confidential. I know the whole transaction is visible, you can see it, but the people behind the transactions is not confidential.
It will take a little bit of work to identify them, but the amount of work is not insurmountable. And if anything, comparing it to traditional digital forensic techniques that I've employed at my previous employers, it is not any more difficult than what we had to do there.
So therefore, if the mafia world's listening to us, they should stop right now because they're being exposed.
If you're committing a crime using any technology, there are ways to identify you, yes.
Okay, can I ask one more question, Chair? Is that okay? And therefore, there is, I think you actually, Mr. Hoegner, you propose that there is probably a need for greater regulation to at least equate it to what FinTrack requires in other currency. And is the way to do it, and in fact some countries are discussing this, is the way to do it, is the choke point to get better identity the person who mines, the merchant who mines the currency? Is that where the choke point is, where you need to find out more? Because the reason you can't open a bank account because people are suspicious. People are scared there's some dirty money being laundering. Is the resolution the miner?
Well, I think the resolution has been enacted and received royal assent this past June. It's that dealing in virtual currencies, as defined by regulation, and again we don't yet know what that means, is going to be the choke point that includes these dealers in the scope of the money services business definition. Will that include miners? I have my doubts. But in any event, it appears that the Department of Finance is saying that that's their choke point and that's their line in the sand where they are going to regulate this technology.
Will that resolve your issue of dealing with banks?
That's really a question for the banks.
Because they're free to do whatever they want.
Whether they have regulatory certainty in this country or not, they are free to accept or decline whomever they wish as customers.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Senator Bellemare to be followed by Senator Ringette.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I can say it was very interesting to listen to all of your testimony. I expected to see people who might show up in jeans, but I can see that the Bitcoin community could certainly pass as a bunch of bankers. Well, personally, after all that we've heard in this committee, I can say one thing. And that is that I really sense that Bitcoin and all of these currencies are here to stay. There's a real paradigm shift happening. And it's difficult sometimes to understand everything when there is a paradigm shift. So, I have a question. Perhaps Mr. Pouliot will answer. Now, you've said that generally, you've said we don't want too much regulation, and I understand because too much regulation will prevent innovation. So, I understand that. Certainly, regulation can kill innovation. And Bitcoin is a little bit like a sausage. You know, the more you eat it, the more you want. So the more you use it, the more you want it. Now, Mr. Pouliot said there may be risks associated with using Bitcoin. And it's the individuals who take on that risk. I see that as a negative thing, as something that might prevent the proliferation of Bitcoins. So would there be a way to independently insure people against these risks, insure Bitcoin users against those risks? And if so, what would be the cost of insuring people? That's my first question. Well, thank you. That's an excellent question. It's important to understand that these are really early days for cryptocurrencies. And it's not always easy to use these currencies. It's not always intuitive. There are a lot of responsibilities that consumers are not used to. For example, to control their money, they need to secure the money, be careful about putting it in the right place. So it's not like regular bank accounts where everything is insured. But I think things will evolve and people will become more and more responsible and more aware of how to use this. There are ways of securing one's Bitcoins, and it's really great. Jillian mentioned multi-signature addresses. Those are Bitcoin wallets that require 2 out of 3 signatures for the Bitcoins to be transferred. So as long as there are 2, unless there are 2 out of 3 people who are really being malicious, they won't be stolen. Like I said, it really is early days. It's like the internet in the early 90s. So if you'll allow me to continue, if someone goes on a trip around the world and let's say he loses his credit card, he can't just walk around with his iPhone and buy Bitcoins. It's more complicated than that, right? So Bitcoin won't replace the old system. You know, it's like these advertisements that we see where some guy's lost in the desert, but he's still got his phone. Yes, so this actually happened to me. I ended up in a situation where I didn't have my wallet and I had to buy something, and fortunately the person who was selling it to me knew what Bitcoin was, and I paid with Bitcoins. Using your iPhone? Well, it was my Android phone, but yeah, same idea. Okay, a smartphone. And I would also add that there are companies that have started offering Bitcoin wallets that are insured. For example, Lloyd's in London made a partnership with a European company to ensure that people's deposits would be insured there. There's also new technology that is emerging, and there are a lot of new innovations. For example, in what's called provable solvency, this is a way for a Bitcoin exchange for a Bitcoin transaction to prove that the reserves that the person says they have really exist. So now, if I were a bank, I would need a whole bunch of people to come and check my books, to check the ledgers, to make sure that all of the money is really there. But with Bitcoin, that can be done without having an external auditor. It can be done through a mechanism called provable solvency. So, as Mr. Pouliot said, there are a lot of innovations like this that are really at a very early stage and that will take a few years to make it onto the market, but there are a lot of innovations in the Bitcoin industry. Just a last very quick question. How many transactions are required before a Bitcoin dies? Well, I don't know exactly the word that you use, but is there a limited number of transactions? No. You're referring to the Bitcoin days destroyed. That's the term that we use, and that's the number of days that a Bitcoin has been in a wallet before being moved. For example, if I haven't moved a Bitcoin in 1 year and then suddenly I move 100 of them, there will be an indicator that will say 100 times 365. So that's the number of days that have been destroyed. And if you look at what's happening with the early adopters, what are they doing with their bitcoins? A really interesting example is that a few days before the Mongox collapse in February, now, if we just look at figure number 7 in my presentation, there were a lot of spikes in the number of Bitcoin days destroyed. And now, the investigation is still ongoing, so we don't have all the details, but according to a leaked document, Mongox had decided to reduce their liabilities, and so to sell off their bitcoins on other markets. And those are bitcoins that did not belong to them, that belonged to their clients. And anyone who looked at the number of Bitcoin days destroyed could see what was happening. They could see that there were a whole bunch of bitcoins or Bitcoin days destroyed, and they realized that something was fishy. Then a few days later, the value of Bitcoin dropped significantly following that incident. So that gives you an idea of what's happening among people who have had Bitcoins for a long time. But a Bitcoin can't die like a piece of physical money. No. Well, now let's say I have the only copy of a private key and I lose it. Well, then those Bitcoins will be lost forever. Okay, thank you very much.
Yet to be followed by Senator Black.
Maybe my first question will be naive, but I thank you guys. But okay, I think we have to come to a mutual understanding in regards to the name that we attach to this currency, because this committee is studying digital currency. Monsieur Babin-Tremblay, you're talking in your document of both digital currency and cryptocurrency. And Monsieur Pouliot, you're also talking about virtual currency. And I think that is one of the issue of public clarification that has to come forth in regards to the, let's say, the phenomena or the trend. So, from your perspective, what would be the adequate currency name that we should all adopt?
But she's asking that 5 months later, what are we studying?
Each of the names, a virtual currency or a digital currency or a cryptocurrency, they're used synonymously even though they have subtly different meanings. A virtual currency is a currency that doesn't exist in your hand. It's more of a ledger-based currency, like a credit card or all of our funds in our bank accounts. That's a virtual currency. We read the number in the ledger when we log into our online banking, but we're not actually holding it. A digital currency is a currency that exists only digital. In this case, a virtual currency is the same thing as a digital currency. It's a number written in my RBC bank account. A cryptocurrency is distinct. A cryptocurrency is a currency based on cryptography, on the laws of mathematics.
So we are not studying the correct trend. We should be studying cryptocurrency.
A cryptocurrency is an example of a digital currency and a virtual currency. If you were to draw a Venn diagram, there's virtual currencies which is large, digital currencies which is inside virtual currencies, and cryptocurrencies which is inside of that. They're used synonymously when talking about Bitcoin, which is the most common cryptocurrency.
So that brings me to the other questions of regulation. You know, if for instance, in the last budget implementation bill that we have referred to digital currency, would that, you know, like because how you name a product, okay, however it's created, is very important in case of regulation and legislation. So
It's an excellent question. The Bill C-31, the Budget Implementation Act, refers to virtual currencies. You might think that that would be a problem because one of the examples given by the government in strengthening their AML-CTF was the example of Bitcoin. However, those are to be defined by regulation. So the government is free to define virtual currency however it wishes. It might be an anomaly that it would be defined for purposes of that law, for purposes of the PCML-TFA, as decentralized, more in the way of a cryptocurrency, decentralized, exchangeable, protected by cryptography and mathematically based. But that's certainly possible. They might change. We won't know until the regulations come out. So they might be able to work within that framework.
Well, usually, the definition of a new word in a piece of legislation is always part of. It is not done afterwards in regulation. So I hope that the Department of Finance is listening to us here so that they can clarify the issue. Another issue that, in regards to your presentation, that were excellent, by the way, is that Monsieur Pouliot, in your presentation, you say that Bitcoin does not need any banking system or authority. And yet, Monsieur Babin-Tremblay, you said to us that you had asked to open a bank account with our current structure of banks, and you were denied. So, where should we be going?
That's a very good question, and it's really important to differentiate between the technological layer of Bitcoin and its real-world applications. So Bitcoin can be conceived as a network of computers talking to each other, and I can send one Bitcoin from one computer to another computer. There's really no problem. If everybody accepted Bitcoins for things at the dépanneur and gas at the gas station, then we would all stay within the Bitcoin network. But of course, the Bitcoin network is not large enough for an individual to be sustainable in Montreal, living and working and going to work. Bitcoin is not at the stage where it's 100% sustainable. So we still definitely need, as humans, to have bank accounts and to be able to have access to credit cards and finance. But Bitcoin as a system is completely independent from the banking system. Just us individual participants in the network are also individual participants in a real world.
Yeah. If I could just give one example where this friction with the traditional banking system exists is, imagine you want to set up a business that operates some sort of service using Bitcoin or some other digital currency, cryptocurrency. You hire employees. You need to pay your employees. They want payment in Canadian dollars. You need to have a bank account most of the time in order to be able to pay them. For many businesses that want to get into this industry, the inability to open a bank account is a huge barrier. Even where these businesses aren't necessarily operating exchanges. So that means they're not in the business of buying and selling Bitcoin. They're doing some sort of ancillary service using this technology. And that's very troublesome because it is a real barrier for the growth of this industry. And there's not much that these businesses can do because, as Senator Massicotte mentioned, banks are not beholden to anyone with respect to who they decide to open accounts for. And they have their own protocols that they need to follow. And with a technology like this that they, frankly, either don't understand or are very ambivalent towards, there seems to be a real problem in that respect.
If I may add to Ms. Friedman's answer, my primary business is a security consulting business. I provide an hourly rate to my customers, and I advise them on cryptocurrencies to secure them, and I perform audits of digital exchanges and the like. I've tried opening up a bank account on behalf of my company with 3 major banks here in Canada. All 3 of them denied me a bank account based solely on the name of my company, Bitcoin Sultans. Because I had Bitcoin in my name, they refused to allow me to have a bank account because they were fearful that I was dealing with cryptocurrencies. Now, when we bill our clients, they pay in Bitcoin. We accept Bitcoin. Thankfully, my lawyer accepts Bitcoin, and some of my vendors accept Bitcoin as well. But in cases where they don't, most of my staff accepts their salary in Bitcoin. However, those that don't, I have to exchange for cash. And now, for a safety perspective, I'm now holding sums of cash that I have to hand out to my employees. This is, unfortunately, what we need to do as Bitcoin businesses who are unable to open up a bank account, despite us not dealing as a Bitcoin exchange.
Okay. Supplementary question. Since the chartered banks in Canada do not want to provide this service, there's, from my perspective, there's 2 other alternatives that could be looked at, and that would be for the Bank of Canada to start to play a role into the cryptocurrency. Or we also have an entity in Canada that has a bank charter and is in need of financial revenue, and it's called Canada Post. So, I'm putting this out there. Is there? How would you respond to these options?
Well, if I may just start before Mr. Babin-Tremblay, I really do think, or at least I hope, that it's just a matter of time before enough people use cryptocurrencies and businesses use cryptocurrencies that banks just simply cannot afford not to have these people as clients. So it might be a problem that will just solve itself in a short while. It's not exactly clear why it's so difficult, why banks are so fearful. It might be regulatory uncertainty. It might be just internal policies, internal miscommunications as well. So I'm hopeful that it will be resolved in a short while.
Okay. It's interesting that you mentioned Canada Post because a couple of months ago there was an investigation by the U.S. Postal Service into whether or not they should be getting into the sale of Bitcoin service. So it's an interesting one. Just like Mr. Pouliot said, I think banks are down the road. They will see the value in Bitcoin. As a matter of fact, they already do. I mean, I met with some high-level executive of some banks here in Canada, and it's very. I was very impressed and even surprised that they knew so much about Bitcoin and that they were like so interested into it. I think down the road there's going to be like a lot of room for a lot of these players to enter the field. Right now it's mostly a matter of like uncertainty, the way I see it, and from what they told me, they don't really know what to expect, and that's why I was mentioning also clarification is very important. As long as we define where Bitcoin falls and how it should be treated, I think eventually banks will be interested in providing some services like that. There's a few examples of banks worldwide, like I think there's one in Germany and there's a few in the U.S. that started offering either Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies related services. One of the main examples, I think last week, 2 American banks announced that they would become Ripple gateways. Ripple is another payment system that that's based on the cryptography, and so it was basically 2 banks that were implementing the software to be part of the Ripple network. So there's certainly some traction like starting to take place. There's some interest for sure, but there's still like a lot of questions that need to be answered first.
Thank you. Senator Black, to be followed by Senator Tanis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to join with my colleagues in thanking and congratulating each of you for these outstanding presentations. I have not been at the Senate long, only about a year and a half, but this is clearly one of the best panels that I've had the privilege of working with, so thank you very much for that. I would like to say to you that, speaking for myself, not for my colleagues, I view my role on this particular file as to assist in a meaningful way innovation, as you have discussed today. So that's how I'm trying to look at this. How do we assist this innovative technology, this disruptive technology as you referred to? So that's what I'm trying to do. But now you have to help me. We've had a lot of conversation today, started by our chairman, around regulation and not. We need specifics. I would need specifics. What would you like this committee to do to assist the development of this? Right to the point here. What would you like us to do? And maybe the answer is nothing. If that's the answer, tell us. But if there is something that you need to do to enhance Canada's position as a destination for innovation, I want to know that. So let's cut right to the chase now and tell us what you need from us.
I guess I'll start. I'm sure each one of my colleagues here will have comments. One of the things that would really be beneficial to the innovation that my company is trying to provide to Canadians is the ability to open a bank account. When I am accepting funds from my customers in exchange for my services, I want to accept a check, but I cannot accept a check because my company has no bank account. I'm simply unable to do that. At the end of my tax year, when it comes time to remit payment to the government, I have no ability to write a check to give the Canadian government the money that they deserve for the business that I've conducted here in Canada. Instead, I have to have one of my employees write a check to the government on behalf of my company, and then I can reimburse them with Bitcoin because we cannot accept funds in any other way other than cash. So to answer your question specifically, Senator Black, one thing that I personally would love to see is the ability for Bitcoin businesses in Canada to open bank accounts at our major banks.
Thank you.
I think we would very much appreciate the focus and ability of the Bitcoin ecosystem, sorry, the cryptocurrency ecosystem, not just limiting it to Bitcoin, to focus on arriving at its own solutions and to see how this plays out in at least the short to medium term. So I would say, bearing in mind the changes that have been made in C31 and the regulations that are forthcoming, I would love to see this committee understand and really get its arms around what cryptocurrency is and not necessarily make any policy changes at this point.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks, but no thanks.
I wouldn't have put it like that.
One of the outstanding issues that remains is the taxation classification of Bitcoin. The CRA classified it, I think, as a non-depreciating capital asset. There's also, like, obviously with Bill C31, it's being included in the proceeds of money laundering and whatever the name of that thing is. You guys know. But so essentially, I mean, one of the key danger here that we have to avoid is to come up with some sort of double taxation scheme for Bitcoin. If you treat it as a commodity, as a for capital gains purposes, you cannot, like, also, I guess, charge a sales tax and also treat it as a like a currency for all practical purposes. So that's one of the main like, I guess, outstanding issues that needs to be resolved. How does it fall? Like, in which category does it fall for taxation purposes? I'm sure Jillian's too have their have some suggestions here, but that's one of the from an entrepreneur, that's one of the important outstanding issues that needs to be cleared.
I think Mr. Hoegner spelled out very well what I would have said as an answer, and I would just add to that to approach this in a way that this question in the spirit of competition between different technologies and institutions that provide financial services, and in a way that is as technologically neutral as possible. So if you look at the different services being provided, it wouldn't be fair necessarily to say that an exchange that has the same risk of money laundering, that's exchanging from euros to Canadian dollars, has to follow this set of rules, but an exchange using digital currency to Canadian dollars doesn't have to follow this set of rules. If the risk is the same and they're providing a similar function, then by virtue of the idea of technological neutrality, they should be legislated similarly. And so I would just simply say that that's what I would add.
It would be the opposite road to take than what the guys in New York have been doing. Like in New York, Benjamin Lawsky, superintendent of financial services, came up with a proposal for BIT licenses, which was very negatively received by the Bitcoin industry for a number of reasons, most of them being that they are not technology neutral. They're imposing additional requirements to Bitcoin companies to comply with, and that's something that's going to most likely result in the isolation of New York and businesses moving out of the state of New York into more friendly jurisdictions, because it's just impossible to comply with from a technical perspective.
Thank you.
And I think my colleagues have really summed it up quite well. I think the important key point is not to discriminate against Bitcoin just because it's a different technology, to really look at it from the functions and the uses of what people are doing with the Bitcoins. The community doesn't ask for much. I think I speak on behalf of most of the community when we say that we're not particularly inclined to go to government for help or for extra help. But for instance, some governments in the UK, some ministers have made very positive statements regarding Bitcoin. I'm speaking particularly of the UK, where the Minister of Finance announced that he believed that UK could become a Bitcoin hub. I think these kinds of statements, the community is quite receptive to government statements about Bitcoin. So I think positive statements from our government saying that they do think it's great innovation, and Canada really does actually have a great potential in Bitcoin. And just stating that fact, just the symbolism of it, I think that's enough.
Interesting. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Black. Senator Tanis.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be brief. I hate following Senator Black because he asks such great questions, and I've got some very mundane ones. I wanted to understand, and I'm new to the committee just in the last couple of meetings. You mentioned, Mr. Babin-Tremblay, you mentioned mining costs versus purchase costs.
Right.
What could you give us just in Canadian dollars in whatever denomination of coin you want to talk about what mining costs are versus purchase costs at the moment?
Right. Mining costs will vary, obviously, between different organizations, different mining setups. It's becoming extremely competitive, especially with the rates now lower than they were a couple months ago. It's approximately the cost of mining a Bitcoin is around $310 as of now, like US dollars. And the cost of acquiring a Bitcoin on an exchange is about like $385 today. So there's still like a significant gap, but it's getting much smaller than what it used to be in the past. Like it was just a couple months ago, the cost of mining Bitcoin was lower than $300, and you could actually only buy it on exchanges for $900 or $1,000.
Yeah.
So it's getting significantly narrower, and there's also like a lot of consolidation happening in the mining space, where you see bigger hosting companies starting offering cloud mining services. So instead of having lots of different people like having their own machines in their basement, now they're all like bunching up together and installing them into huge data centers to benefit from economies of scale. So it's there's still a little bit of way to go before we reach an equilibrium in the production costs and the purchasing costs of Bitcoin, but it's getting there. At some point, like it happened before when the current technology that's used to mine Bitcoin, which is called ASIC for application-specific integrated circuit. Before that, people were using GPUs, graphic cards, to mine Bitcoin, and at some point, the price of Bitcoin went down around $2, and the electricity cost of mining these Bitcoins was about in the same range. So you had at some point some people starting to unplug their miners because it was no longer profitable to mine the Bitcoins. So if I don't know if this is going to happen this time, because there's a little, like, the dynamic is a little bit different with data centers. Usually it's longer term contracts, so it doesn't really make sense to shut down your machines, even if you're losing a little bit of money mining, because you already have the space, you have to pay for it. It's your biggest expense, so it makes sense to keep mining. Even if you're losing a little bit of money, you'll lose much less than if you just stop mining completely.
Thank you. And then finally, and I know this probably would be a guess, but Mr. Perklin, you're accepting Bitcoins in exchange for consulting about Bitcoins. It's kind of inside baseball activity. What percent, and there's all the speculative purchases like Senator Gerstein, who bought it and hasn't spent it. Doesn't know how. What percentage or of the transactions that are occurring are genuinely exchanges of the currency for something of value that is needed by somebody to live their everyday life?
Great question. Just as a small correction, my company, Bitcoin Consultants, we provide security consulting services. While that does engage in Bitcoin security, it's any kind of security. Okay. But to answer your question more directly about what percentage is required to, I guess, what percentage is required to live off of Bitcoin? Or
no, I'm wondering at this stage, are we all just trading Bitcoins like baseball cards and so on, and versus how much is actually transactions to purchase something of value that we need?
Right. That depends on the vendors that your company chooses. For example, with my company, there are certain costs where we have to remit in dollars and not in Bitcoins. So if I were to estimate, maybe about 35 to 40% of of the money that we spend needs to be converted to dollars in order to remit to our vendors. Whereas the vast majority, which covers dollars going to our staff for the work that they complete, dollars going to our accountant and to our legal fees, that is all staying in Bitcoin only because the vendors that we've chosen choose to accept that as an additional medium. So it really depends on the vendors that you choose.
I understand. So I'm looking for a macro answer. The whole Bitcoin world.
Okay.
Thank you. Yes. Go ahead.
It's obviously very hard to come up with a number because we don't know everyone who's using Bitcoin and why they're using it for. But there's been a number of high-profile companies that started to accept Bitcoin in last year. Notable examples will include Overstock, Expedia, Tiger Direct, Dell, for example. And all of them basically reported higher than expected cryptocurrencies purchases from their users, from their clients. So it's certainly started with a much more like speculative environment. People were buying it for what the future could bring. But nowadays, I mean, you're starting to see people like using it for real purposes, to buy things, to buy goods and services, just like they can. I mean, there's a lot in Montreal, for example. There's quite a few lawyers and accounting firms that will accept Bitcoin. So the Bitcoin Embassy, the Bitcoin Foundation have been using these resources, paying them in Bitcoin to provide professional services, and it's just going to grow from here. Like there's I think a major milestone will be reached when you can actually pay for gasoline or for food at most convenience stores or grocery stores with Bitcoin. I think there's some initiative already. Like there's a few companies that came up with some I think coin point for fuel or something like that, which is a gift card basically that you can buy with Bitcoin and use it at the pump to pay for your gas. But this is going to increase over time. It's becoming less. I guess there's still like a big speculative component to the whole thing. We're still at the very early stages. There's a lot of upside remaining, but at the same time, it's getting we're starting to see more and more useful use, I guess, for cryptocurrencies.
And if I could just quickly add on to that, there is one innovative service provided by a Canadian company based out of Montreal that allows you to pay any service that exists as a payee within your online banking. For example, a credit card. Using a service such as this, you can buy anything with your credit card and then pay off your credit card with Bitcoins directly. So with services like this, maybe 95, if not more, % of any purchase that you make can all be paid with Bitcoin today.
That concludes round one of our questions. We have just over 20 minutes left, and I want you to know we have no shortage of people on the list for round two, so I'm going to move to it immediately. I might indicate that I have Senator Massicotte, Senator Tkachuk, Senator Bellemare, and Senator Ringuette, and anybody else who would like to be added to the list so we can divide up the time. Starting with Senator Tkachuk, please. Round two.
Just a couple of questions. One is a follow-up to Senator Bellemare's question about how many users can it support. Is it, if you're mining the Bitcoins, is there a time when the demand would be great and therefore the miners not maybe able to keep up? Or how will the expansion of that money supply?
If I may answer that question, the money supply of Bitcoin is set in stone. It's going to be 21 million units. However, these units can be divided up to 8 digits after the decimal separator. So it's not like the market rate, the exchange rate will serve as the the buffer, I would say, for adoption. Essentially, there's not going to be more Bitcoins in circulation. However, you can divide one Bitcoin into smaller units, and these units become more valuable in themselves the higher the number of people that are using the network. So it's really like the way the network will expand with new users is most likely going to be the price going up. More users mean obviously a smaller share of the pie, and it's one of the interesting charts that I prepared is the first one, Figure 1, Metcalfe's law, that essentially states that a network's value is proportional to the square of its number of users. In this case, we can see a almost perfect correlation between the exchange rate and the daily transactions and the unique addresses used, which is the best proxy to determine the number of users. We can see that they're matching like very, very closely. So what happens is the more users, the more addresses being used, the more transactions happening, the higher likelihood of the price following.
How many, these are just, I have two just information questions. Someone was, I don't know who was mentioning the amount of ATMs in Canada. How many ATMs do we have that supply Bitcoins in Canada?
Unfortunately, unfortunately, I don't have the specific number. I'll go with what I know. In Montreal, Guillaume, correct me if I'm wrong, around 8. In Toronto, with the ones recently installed, do you guys know?
I believe it's about 10.
10. Ottawa, there's what, 4 maybe? Vancouver,
there's one for sure.
Yeah, there's one for sure. They're really all over the place. Vancouver has a lot of them. Calgary, Halifax, North Bay, a lot of cities. So yeah.
When you open a Bitcoin, you're saying that because your company has the name Bitcoin in it, the bank won't allow you to open an account using that name. You could use another name though. But would it keep? I want to know how would your account be kept? Would it be kept in Bitcoins or would it be kept in Canadian currency?
Well, when I was trying to open up a bank account, I was specifically trying to open up a Canadian bank account, and when I was filling out the forms and the bank officer saw the name of my company, before I was even finished the form, they stopped me and said, "Sorry, sir, you cannot open up a bank account here." They told me that they had received an email from head office. It was apparently a blast email that all bank employees received. Do not open any bank accounts for Bitcoin companies. Any company that accepts, remits, transmits, or converts Bitcoins refuse to open up any bank account. I felt that was very discriminatory, but it is their bank and they can choose their customers.
Okay, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Massicotte, to be followed by Senator Belmar.
Thank you, Chair. Two concerns I have for your future. One is taxation. You mentioned earlier, not only income tax, but the way they're coming down on you is they want to tax any variance, and the second thing is the sales tax. But let me jump to the other issue, is timing. I understand when you use your card, you're at a dépanneur and you're trying to pay for the pack of gum. There's what, a 6-minute or 8-minute delay if the merchant wants to confirm payment. Is that, can that be reduced? Because that's a long time.
Do you want to take that? There's a difference between transmitting the payment and having the payment recorded in the blockchain. When I transmit payment, anybody can see the payment instantly, and they can see that that Michael just attempted to give a payment to Senator Massicotte. But in order for it to be written into the ledger book, that is what can vary anywhere between 30 seconds and 1 hour. Regardless of it being recorded in the ledger book, because I can see and detect the transmission on the network, I know that payment has been rendered. It's no different than the fact that if you're buying a pack of gum, which is very low value, it takes 2 seconds. Here's some change. Here's the gum. Whereas if you're buying a car or a home, a significantly longer time is required in order to make sure that those funds are going through.
The problem is that when you go to the dépanneur, though, I can appreciate you see a transaction, but unless you know the customer, you want to wait for payment because it's like writing a check a little bit. You want to make sure it gets cleared. Well, so won't that be a limiting factor for or will cash still be king in that respect?
Not for small transactions. If it's a pack of gum or a coffee, there's very low risk. Whereas again, if it's a car or a home, now you want to make sure that every T is crossed and every I is dotted. You have the time to wait for the hour confirmation necessary.
Okay, thank you.
Right, and if I can just add something. The confirmation time, just like Mr. Perklin said, is when the transaction is recorded in the blockchain. But since everyone sees it right from the moment everything has been transmitted, you already know that payment has been made. When, like, the reason why we use a confirmation mechanism here is to discourage some types of attacks that could be made against the Bitcoin network. One of them is the double spend attack, which is probably the most important we're trying to mitigate here. And the double spend attack essentially means I'm sending you some money and then I'm trying to roll back the transaction and spending it again. That's the reason why we have confirmations, because the higher the number of confirmations, the higher the cost of performing a successful double spending attack. It really means someone has to have a lot of mining equipment and to try to outrun the main blockchain on the network, come up with their own version of the blockchain, then spending some money, and then publishing their own version of the blockchain, reverting in the process all the transactions that occurred since then. But the costs of doing this are prohibitive. If you're going to be buying a pack of gum or a bottle of Coke at the dépanneur, you're not going to spend like the hundreds of thousands of dollars, even millions of dollars it requires to perform such an attack. So it's really like a risk mitigation kind of thing, where you really want to put it in perspective with the amount that you're transacting. If you're telling me I'm going to send you $100 million in Bitcoin, I'm going to wait for my 6 confirmations. but if it's a pack of gum, no big deal.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Massicotte. Senator Belmar, to be followed by Senator Ringett.
Merci beaucoup. Je pense, monsieur.
Thank you very much. Mr. Babin-Tremblay, you are an economist, is that right? I work in quantitative finance, so more or less. Well, I just wanted to go back to a point that has to do with the amount of currency that exists, the amount of bitcoins that exist. MV equals PQ is a well-known formula. So the volume of the currency leads to a certain amount. In any case, we know that with fiat money that's printed by a bank, well, when you increase the amount of money in circulation, you can increase interest rates. And when bitcoins are printed, that can have an effect on the value of the bitcoin. But in your answer to Senator Tkachuk, you said, well, there are 21 million bitcoins in circulation, the value of them tends to increase, but then there's also V from that equation I mentioned, which is velocity. So if bitcoins don't die, there is velocity that can increase. Yes, that's true. So the value of the transactions that can be done with 21 million bitcoins has not yet been calculated. Is that right? Well, that's sort of what I'm talking about in figure number 1. If you look at daily transactions, it's the number of transactions that happen every day, the average number. And we're looking at around 80,000 per day, which represents a fairly dramatic increase. It's not an exponential increase, it's a linear increase. But I think we have some figures. You can see that in 2011, we were at around 5,000 transactions per day, and now we're up to around 80,000 per day. So clearly there is a relationship between these two factors. Velocity does have an impact on price, fairly direct impact. You need to buy Bitcoin in order to exchange them. So if I want to have a transaction with Bitcoin, of course I have to get Bitcoin from somewhere. When new Bitcoins are created, it's not through a transaction. It's through mining, yes. And so that depends on the relative cost of the Bitcoin and the cost of production? Well, yes and no. The algorithm is designed in such a way that if the difficulty of the network is reduced, or the number of people with Bitcoins is reduced, then the value of Bitcoins also is reduced. So this is something that is adjusted, and there is a block created about every 10 minutes. And currently we're talking about a price of 25 Bitcoins per block. And that is reduced by half around every 4 hours. Now, mining, I mean, there's no factor that would allow you to stop mining in time to fix it. My final question, if you'll allow me a quick one, has to do with China. Obviously, a lot of people in China, a lot of transactions happening there. You said that they were big users of Bitcoin. Now, do those users use Bitcoin to transact among themselves with yen, or do they use it more for international trade? Because, of course, we know that Bitcoin is useful for international transactions. So I'm wondering if, Germans, for example, want to get some yen. Is that possible? How does that work? Now, obviously, it's difficult to get a big picture of what's happening. You really have to be on the ground to see it with your own eyes. But I think we can assume that one of the reasons Bitcoin is so used in China is for remittances and for moving capital outside of China's borders, because that's very controlled by the Chinese government. So that's one of the main reasons that people might want to use Bitcoin. That's why it's so popular in China. Then there's also the fact that China is still under a communist government. It's a fairly authoritarian government. And so I think this is a reaction to the government's practices. People are using Bitcoin to get away from some of the government's practices. So it's a way of affirming it's making a political statement, yes.
Une question très courte.
Senator Ranguet, yes, I have a very short question that follows up on Senator Black's question, and it has to do with what you want from us. Should we recommend that the Receiver General of Canada agree to accept corporate tax and GST payments in Bitcoin?
that, or has that been done before?
I don't think so.
There is one.
Yes, there is. There's a city in the United States. I apologize, the name of the city escapes me, but they allow municipal taxes to be paid in Bitcoin, and they pay the salary of their chief of police in Bitcoin. I apologize, I don't know the name of the city.
Find it and send it to the committee clerk, and then we will be waiting with bated breath.
I will.
Thank you.
One very quick point, because I think there was a miscommunication earlier. Senator Belmar, there are not currently 21 million Bitcoins in circulation. There's only 13.3 million. Okay, good.
Thank you. Senator Tanis.
Thank you. I wanted to come back. Did we ever get a reason? Did any of you ever get a reason from the banks as to why they would not open an account? Was it because of AML, ATF, and they can't see into your business and understand it, and therefore they're ultimately the front lines for AML, ATF. If you're doing something wrong, they're the ones who get to go to jail over it. Is that their excuse, if you will?
There's been a paucity of specifics that's been forthcoming from the banks about why they are hesitant to engage with actors in this sector. Ultimately, again, it would be a question for the banks. They have put forward concerns about sources of funds and linking funds with identity. I can tell you two things. One is that those problems, while real, are manageable and can be addressed. And I can also tell you that international banks are willing to take on this business. So, again, bearing those facts in mind, that would be an interesting question to ask the banks.
Anybody, you're entrepreneurs, anybody thought of a credit union for Bitcoin people?
That's been explored, and some of the bigger ones actually will not take, to be fair, will not take any money services businesses. So they're not discriminating against Bitcoin. They're just discriminating against all MSBs.
What about your own credit union for Bitcoin users?
That's something that's been discussed in Bitcoin circles. Just to add also to other reasons that were given for not taking Bitcoin companies by bank, there's also the reputational risk, and some of them even mentioned that it was a direct competition, although I believe it's not exactly a direct competition, but it was mentioned. So.
Lies a lot of their profits.
If I could just add to that, it will be interesting to see once the regulations come out and come into force, so that it will be very clear to banks what the requirements of businesses dealing in digital currency are. So once those obligations are clear and digital currency businesses follow exactly the same rules, very in complete conformity as other MSBs, that's where it may get very interesting to see whether or not they'll be prepared to take on these clients as banks. And in fact, when the anti-money laundering legislation came out originally and created this section for MSBs, banks also shut down the bank accounts of traditional money service businesses. So it's not and that was a little bit, I think, of a growing period adjustment, banks trying to determine how to mitigate their own risks. So perhaps right now it's fair to give them the benefit of the doubt in that respect, but it will be interesting to see once everything is set out a little bit more clearly. And the other, just to answer your question about the credit union, I would answer that with another question, that it would be very interesting to explore that in Canada, where the business of banking is by and large subject to the Bank Act, which has very high capital requirements, amongst other very onerous obligations to put forth and develop a traditional financial institution like a bank. So that might actually be a very big barrier to the establishment of a bank that does cryptocurrency Canada.
Thank you. To each member of our panel, from each member of the committee, I would like to extend our great appreciation for your appearance today. You have been an absolutely outstanding panel, and we are greatly appreciative of it. I would mention, just before we conclude, and I'm going to start by quoting from Mr. Pouliot's opening statement, where he refers to a gentleman by saying, according to renowned cryptocurrency expert Andreas Antonopoulos, I wanted you all to know, and I want our listening audience to know, he will be our witness next Wednesday. Should provide the most interesting time. Again, thank you. This meeting is concluded.